Good afternoon. My name is Damel Swebi, and I'll be presenting on the U.S. intervention in Haiti, 1915. My question is question 4, and it is evaluate the economic and political reasons for the U.S. intervention in Haiti in 1915. Now, to evaluate each reason for the intervention, I use the following criteria. How valid was the motive for invasion? Was the motive more considerate or beneficial to Haiti or the US? Did the motive help the US achieve its true purpose? At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was determined to control the West and gain footing as a global economic powerhouse. They started a campaign of deceitfulness and denial throughout the Caribbean, with the narrative that their expansion was beneficent and not imperialist. Now, the US tried very hard not to be considered by their citizens in the US or by citizens in these Caribbean countries as being imperialist. They didn't want to seem as though they were coming to recolonize per se or take over. So they said, we are your friends and we have a common enemy, which are the ex colonizers. So we are here to help you. So they portray themselves as a savior, bearing the gospels of democracy and capitalism by which the sufferers may be saved. Now let's talk about Haiti. Haiti was struggling politically and economically. In the years after Haiti fought and won their independence from France, up to this point now in 1915, they had a lot of troubles politically, and their politics was filled with a lot of violence and corruption. And to add to that trouble, they were overextended economically. They had constant political conflicts, and in that time in Haiti, they had a mainly non-democratic leadership, and I believe at one point leadership was hereditary in Haiti, and so it wasn't much about the people having a say in leadership and all that. So the conflicts that could arise from that, and the corruption that can come in as well. Also, they had extensive financial debts to repay. Now, we all know Haiti had to be paying France in order for them to be recognized as an independent nation and all that. So that kind of bled them dry financially. And then now they had invited a lot of foreign investors to come and invest in Haiti, and they were doing a lot of business with foreigners and so on. So they were in a lot of debt with economically with other foreigners. And one of the big partners that they were in debt with at the time was the US. Let us recall that the US wanted to outclass the former European colonizers and to achieve political and economic hegemony in the region. So the US was always trying to gain as much political and economic power as possible in the Caribbean, so to broaden their global footprint. Now, the US always had an interest in Haiti, mainly as a potential military and financial base in the Caribbean. So long before 1915, America was grooming Haiti for American usefulness. And so American banks and American investors pumped a lot of capital into the Haitian economy. And also, on several occasions before 1915, the US had sent American troops into Haiti to quell conflicts under the guise of protecting American life and American property and American investments. But in reality, America had real plans for Haiti. Haiti was overflowing with corruption, violence, and famine. Now, as we've stated before, Haiti had a lot of problems and they were governed poorly, and the affairs of the country were mismanaged, or if they were managed at all. So there was always conflict with the leadership, And so governments were always being overthrown and presidents getting assassinated. In fact, between 1911 up to 1915, six Haitian presidents were assassinated, and so the struggle was really bad. Almost inevitably, in 1915, the assassination of Haitian President Wilbur Sam provided the perfect SOS invitation for the US to intervene. So now the US President Wilson now had the final public justification for going in to help Haiti. This is my thesis statement. The political and economic reasons for US intervention in Haiti in 1915 were selfish but functional in securing their interests. Now, the reasons for the intervention. So, the political reasons were one, Germanophobia, and two, political and racial paternalism. And the economic reason we look at is economic entanglement and pursuits. What is Germanophobia? Germanophobia is the fear of German ideals, influence, and actions. So the US had a case of Germanophobia in the early 1900s. So German influence in Haiti threatened American endeavors, and this forced the US to make defensive actions by intervening and reasserting her goal of Caribbean hegemony. Remember, between 1914 and 1918 was World War One, and so German presence right here in the US backyard, in a country where they had investment and had plans for, that must did not sit well with the US at all. Now, Germany had an economic foothold in Haiti and was backed by a powerful navy. So Germany had found Haiti to be an easy country to trade with, and eventually Germans became open to the idea of getting integrated into the Haitian society. And so what had happening was Germans marrying to Haitians, sorry, and they married into some of the most prominent Haitian families, the most wealthy Haitian families, and this also helped them to bypass the constitutional prohibition in Haiti at the time for foreigners to own land. So in 1910, Haitian Germans controlled around 80% of Haiti's international commerce, and also the main wharf in Port-au-Prince was German controlled. So even though the amount of Germans in Haiti was small compared to the wider population, they had a huge amount of economic power. So the US feared that Germany would act on the opportunity to control Haiti after a potential collapse. Imagine if after a president was assassinated, no new president emerged. Imagine if after a government was overthrown, no new leadership group emerged. Imagine if after a group of Haitian citizens started an uprising, nobody quelled the conflict. So the US thought about this and realized that Germany having this much economic power would only set them in such a position that they would be able to take over Haiti. So the US had to step in so that they could squash this potential. And so the US prioritized the safety of American life, investments, and geopolitics. And so when the US invaded Haiti in 1915, they moved swiftly to imprison the Germans, and they confiscated German property. And also the American hostility forced a lot of the Germans to flee Haiti. So essentially the US did by invading Haiti was protecting their American citizens who were there, protecting the investments that they had made in Haiti, and they were also ensuring that they were protecting their backyard, which was here in the Caribbean, not allowing Germany to get a stronghold here in the Caribbean from which they could launch attacks on the US mainland. Now, the consideration of Haitian issues were secondary and used as a mask for the US true purposes. Remember that the Germans and German Haitians played vital roles in the economy and society of Haiti. Never mind how corrupt or dysfunctional this society was. And so Germans were business people and they were business owners and they provided goods and services and they were also important to their neutralized Haitian families. Now, could the US have fulfilled this 80% international commerce gap that they had now imprisoned or chased out of Haiti? More than likely they couldn't, but that wasn't their issue. Their main problem was getting their enemy out of their backyard, getting their enemy away from their potential new prey toy, which was Haiti. And so Haitian issues weren't really on the forefront of the American actions, but they put that out in their newspaper that, oh, we're here helping Haiti, chasing out the monster Germany away from them. But in reality, they just got rid of their enemy so that they could now be better set up to fulfill their wishes in Haiti. Now, the next political reason for the intervention was political and racial paternalism. So, paternalism is the interference of a government without consent, and it is defended by the idea that the people who are being interfered with will be better off or better protected from harm. Racial paternalism now is the belief that one race is superior and has the right to rule and guide an inferior race. And usually, and also in this case, it is an issue between whites and blacks. So the US believed that they had the right to help the inferior Haiti restore governance and provide guidance. So the US believed that, hey, we're such a great and marvelous nation, an independent nation, such a beacon here in the western region. It is our duty to help the struggling black nation, which was Haiti, in a world at the time where most nations that were majority blacks were still colonies. The unstable Haitian political and social order concerned the US, and the US saw Haiti as clueless toddlers who needed help in leading and caring for themselves. So, when the Haitians weren't having conflict and fighting each other, they were going deeper and further into debts. Then there was the emerging issue with leadership problems, and you had the emerging cycle where a president gets instated, then corruption and problems start, and then the citizens are displeased, and then it ends in that president getting assassinated, and then the cycle continues. So the US thought us going and intervening in Haiti might just be the best thing that ever happened to Haitians. So the US provided a filtered form of democracy that barely benefited the Haitians. Over the next 18 years up to in the 1930s, America put in a set of puppet presidents and they ruled Haiti through a military high commission. And so Haitians didn't really have a lot of say in their administration. They didn't have a lot of power in what was happening with their affairs. And the US continually promised a presidential election to the Haitians, and it was always postponed. And this caused a lot of discontentment within the Haitian populace, and a lot of insurrectionists had emerged during that time, but the Americans had military presence in Haiti, and so they squashed all of these uprisings. It wasn't up until in 1930, after the US president sent a special commission to investigate and see how things were going in Haiti, and they reported that yes, man, we achieved our goal. There's political stability in Haiti now, and so they decided that now they can get to vote for a president for themselves. And so the Haitians elected President Stevie Vincent in 1930, and the US finally started to give them some public infrastructure like roads and public buildings, and they improved the medical facilities that were there at the time as well. But all this was just menial work. Haiti was treated as an estate with which the Americans were entrusted, and the resources were selfishly mismanaged. Now, how beneficial could this 18-year occupation of Haiti have been if immediately after leaving the country practically went back to the state it was in before? Political conflicts, chaos socially, and all those. Even in the years that the US were occupying Haiti, these problems still existed, but the Americans had what they wanted. They had power and they had control, and they were able to manipulate all the Haitian resources and do as they wanted to. So, in reality, did the US actually help Haiti, or did they just stifle Haiti, squeezed out what they wanted to get, and then left as soon as they realized we probably don't need much of what we are getting this way anymore? Now, the economic reason and the final reason for intervention that we look at was the economic entanglement and pursuits. Economic involvement and pursuits in Haiti influenced the US's decision to intervene and subsequently exploit the Haitian economy. Remember that the US had major plans for Haiti, and to them, Haiti was like a fruit, a ripe fruit, waiting to be plucked. And now the instability in Haiti, the constant conflicts in Haiti, gave the Americans the excuse now to expand into this new economic market. American capital was entangled in the Haitian bank, fueling the need to invade amidst the instability. Now, it is documented that as early as 1910, US banking interests had gotten partial ownership of the Haitian National Bank. So the US had already thrown a lot of money into the Haitian economy, and so they could not afford for Haiti to collapse. They couldn't afford for the Haitian economy to fail because that would cost them a lot of their investment. And so other American investments were at risk with the potential collapse of the Haitian economy. A lot of American owned businesses and American property were in Haiti. And so, with potential collapse on the horizon, the Americans could not sit by and allow this to happen because they would be at a great loss. Additionally, the US was targeting Haiti as a potential economic hub for American land ownership and railroad development. Now, the Americans saw great potential in Haiti, and they wanted Haiti to be their great center of commerce in the Caribbean region. And from here, they could control a number of assets and businesses and amass a lot of capital. And they could also potentially use Haiti as a post from where they could operate in the wider Caribbean. Now, the intervention was very beneficial to US investors but exploitive to the Haitian economy. So, when the US went in and took over in Haiti and took control of the central bank and all that, they started to give loans to Haiti so that they could start paying off some of the debts that they had been owing to international investors, and majority of the international investors that had benefited from these loans that Haiti was granted were American investors, and so America was practically giving Haiti huge sums of money to pay back to Americans, and then Haiti had to pay back this money with huge um they had to pay back with a lot of interest. Also, the US barely invested in any production that would benefit Haiti. They barely invested in any infrastructure that would help bring in revenue for Haiti and so on. And so, in the end, the intervention was really draining to the Haitian economy. Now, to conclude, in conclusion, it is reasonable to believe that the political and economic reasons for US intervention in Haiti were egotistical but effective in achieving their ultimate pursuits. The German presence in Haiti was unsettling to the US, hence she moved to assert dominance and emphasize her pursuit of Caribbean hegemony. Additionally, the US thought it was her duty to help Haiti achieve and maintain stability within the society. US investments and the economic plan she had for Haiti forced her to intervene as a protective measure. These are my sources. Thanks for listening, and I hope it was informative.